I actually started studying music when I was 19 at TUT. And I started guitar a bit earlier than that, around 14 or 15, but I only really started seriously practicing when I left high school, so when I was 18. Okay. So yeah, it took me a very, very long time to sort of realize what needed to be done with the instrument and with music in general, in order to develop, in order to progress, etc., etc. And so I was quite a late sort of arriver to the world of guitar and music at large. When I first started playing guitar, I was really a singer. So I started playing guitar, accompanying myself whilst singing. Through that, I sort of started listening to more harmonically adventurous bands like Radiohead and Portishead and early Coldplay. And through that sort of common harmonic language with certain types of jazz and Brazilian music especially, I transitioned into jazz guitar. So it was a very, very long process. At first, I really didn't like jazz. I thought it sounded like chaos. I didn't know what was happening. I guess it's like that for most people who listen to it, actually. Yeah. But yeah, it took a very long time. It wasn't jazz in the beginning, for sure not. Yeah, I think TUT was really good in terms of giving a very structured syllabus. So a very structured approach to learning the guitar. Whereas in the Netherlands, it was more about hearing like excellent players all the time, and also my teachers being just world-class musicians. So TUT taught me the nuts and bolts of music, and the Netherlands taught me the aesthetic, like the jazz aesthetic and how to interface with the jazz aesthetic. That happened quite early on, I would say. I think that when I decided to study music, I didn't really have any musical experience at all. And I was really training to become more maybe a political scientist or a historian or a physicist, like more the hard and soft sciences. The school that I went to was very academically strong. And when I made a decision to study music, I realized that I was so far behind that by necessity I would have to work incredibly hard just to catch up. I started really late and I never had any formal musical education when I was growing up. So I realized, first of all, the music industry is very, very difficult, so you have to be excellent. But I was also coming from a very sort of disadvantaged point in terms of my musical development. So that really started from when I decided to study music when I was 18, then this sort of thing of, okay, now I really have to get my act together and be incredibly disciplined came in, I would say. And it continues to this day because I always feel like I'm a couple of steps behind everyone else, and that I always need to develop to catch up. So it's intense, but it's also a nice feeling as well because it feels like I always have to develop in a way. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, on the instrument in particular, from the beginning, I was really into traditional jazz guitar players like Wes Montgomery and Pat Martino and Charlie Christian and Django Reinhardt, really the traditional guys. And then later on, sort of slightly more modern guys, slightly like George Benson, and then even more modern like Pat Metheny and John Scofield. And then really when I got to the Netherlands, my whole sort of concept of modern jazz guitar opened up because there were all sorts of players that I was exposed to, like Kurt Rosenwinkel and Mike Moreno and Gilad Hexelman and Lage Lund, the sort of young god, if you will, of jazz guitar. And those, I would say, the whole sort of history has influenced me in a very profound way. But I've been really, really influenced by music that is non-jazz as well. So specifically in my composition, a lot of that comes from before I listened to jazz. So a lot of it comes from my Radiohead days or my Portishead days. And then later on, my time transcribing a lot of traditional and urban syncretic Black South African music. So jazz guitar is really a very small piece of the pie in terms of my influences. There's so many musical and then non-musical academic influences like Achille Mbembe and Frantz Fanon and a whole lot of post-colonial theorists that impact my work very, very profoundly. So it's really a mishmash, my influences. I wouldn't narrow down my musical influences to just jazz guitar players. It's so much broader than that for me. Yes, I would say definitely. I think that my family definitely places an emphasis on work and you creating meaning and value in your own life. So from a young age, I think it was really drilled into me that if you want your life to be meaningful, you have to work hard and create that meaning for yourself. A sort of very Protestant work ethic, as they call it. And there's no doubt that that has influenced me profoundly. But I think another thing is that I am really always trying to retain some sense of childhood wonder that I had with music. And the problem, of course, is the more you listen to music, the more detached you become from that feeling that you first had when you heard music, when you were first inspired by it. So the only way to overcome that is by continuously searching and trying to find new things. So that's what it's always been for me. I mean, you don't make money with music. We choose to study music because it makes us feel a certain way. So for me, it's incredibly important to always retain that feeling. And the only way to retain that feeling, as I said, is through constantly searching and constantly, once something becomes familiar to me, I stop having that feeling. And then I really feel like what I'm doing is a lie. So I have to search for something new so that I have that feeling again. So it's a combination of the Protestant work ethic, I guess, and also really needing that sort of childlike connection to music that I had when I was a teenager. I guess that the answer to that question kind of exists in the question itself, in that, well, first of all, I moved back to South Africa, but when I was in the Netherlands, that's when I really reconnected with my South African, and specifically from my mother's side, who's Siswati and black, basically, and my dad is white and Jewish. And the reason why is because I went to the Netherlands with this impression of it as a very free, open, liberal society, and in many ways it is. But it is also not devoid of the same problems that other European countries have in terms of viewing foreigners in a particular way, and specifically black foreigners. So by being lumped together with all of the other black foreigners in this country, in the mind of Dutch natives, I had to reevaluate my sense of self. And in that process of reevaluating my sense of self, I came closer to home. When I was here, I really had very little connection to my mother's culture and to black African culture in general. I always felt a bit uncomfortable because I always felt like I can't really speak an African language well, and every time I tried to hang with my sort of black friends in school, I always felt like a bit of an outsider. And when I got to the Netherlands, I felt like an outsider being black, so it sort of pushed me towards my mother's culture and really towards rediscovering certain things that I guess because of the history of this country I denied, because, you know, for a long time we were taught to be black is less, etc., etc. So subconsciously that seeps into you in a way. And obviously through this process of rediscovering myself, I realized that of course it's nonsense, and we have so many, culturally and intellectually and in every sense, black Africans have so much to offer the world. And it's, people call it the last frontier, or whatever you want to call it, the last cultural frontier. I think it's nonsense. I think there's many examples of where black African culture has interfaced with popular culture and given rise to the most beautiful music in the world. So I am very much an unashamed black nationalist, and that process came about through living in the Netherlands. Before then, it wasn't like that at all. Yeah, well, this is the whole issue, that the instrument is subject to so many different treatments depending on who's playing it. I remember watching an interview with Stanley Jordan, and he said the guitar is one of the few instruments that, I mean, you can get so many different sounds from the instrument. And because of that, it's used in very many different contexts. And because of that, a lot of people use very many different contexts when playing particular styles. So for instance, you'll often hear rock guitar players who are inspired by jazz, or blues guitar players like B.B. King who are inspired by jazz, or jazz guitar players like John Scofield who are inspired by rock and blues. So there's so much overlap between all these various genres because of the sort of in-between nature of the guitar as an instrument itself. That it's very, very difficult to sort of categorize and decide whether it's right now a jazz sound, whether it's right now a rock sound, whether it's right now a gypsy jazz sound, whether it's right now a blues sound, etc., etc. In my listening to most jazz guitarists, they really bring a lot of different influences into their playing. Having said that, you can definitely hear different types of guitar players. So you can definitely hear people like Wes Montgomery and Charlie Christian, who are a particular school of jazz guitar playing, who play with particular guitars. They use much less effects on their guitar. They really go directly in with a bit of reverb. And then you have other guitar players like Pat Metheny and John Scofield, who really treat their guitar with a lot of effects. And it's very clear that there's a very strong rock and blues influence in that treatment of the guitar. sort of coming from Jimi Hendrix and his sort of sonic innovations with what he did with the guitar. So yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer because there's a lot of in-between guitar players, but there's definitely schools of guitar playing, sort of traditional jazz guitar, more rock-based jazz guitar, more blues-based jazz guitar, etc., etc. I would say that I, by definition, break rules because my own compositions, I don't really consider them jazz compositions. They're really incredibly personal. They're an amalgam of all the styles that I've fallen in love with over the years. And it's very difficult to define what that is, and the only way I can really define it is as me, as Vuma. And I guess the strongest in terms of my improvisation, it's very clear that I have a very strong traditional jazz guitar background. So coming from Wes Montgomery and George Benson and Pat Martino, with also a lot of modern guys, so like Lage Lund and Kurt Rosenwinkel, and a lot of Dutch guitar players, because that's where I studied and that's where I lived with. Like my guitar teacher, Jesse van Roele, who's one of the best guitar players in the world. Very, very influential. So there's almost like a difference between my compositional style and in my improvisational style. And my improvisational style is very rooted in the jazz tradition, and my compositional style is not. It's really a mix, a hodgepodge of many different things. In guitar specifically, that I'm not so sure of because I don't read so many guitar books. Yeah. But in general, I would say anything by Frans Fanon, anything by Achille Mbembe. And then in terms of South African academics, David Copland and Gwen Ansell are very, very big influences on me, and Christopher Ballantine. He has a book called Marabi Nights, which is an excellent book for understanding the history of South African jazz. And then in terms of non-fiction, I really like Zadie Smith, any book by Zadie Smith. I really like Jonathan Franzen. I'm not technically meant to say that, but I really like him. I really like Chimamanda a lot, really a lot. Anything that sort of speaks for the other, I'm very much into reading that sort of stuff.